Hey everyone, welcome to the Bible Belt Bros podcast. Today I am finally away from Andrew after he got his new house. I've seen him way too much, too often. So today we are down in the Houston, Texas area, hanging out with my real bro-in-law,
Yes.
Matthew, bronze level 2 in Rocket League. We play a lot of video games when we're together. Probably the only time you ever get to play video games.
The only time I ever play video games, it basically is when we're together.
So I don't know if that says much about me, I don't know. I don't know what you're trying to imply there, that I'm always the one wanting to play video games, but it's probably true.
It speaks to the depth of our relationship.
Yeah, exactly. I guess tell us a little bit about you, Matt, what you like to do for fun. What do you do for a living, stuff like that?
Well, since me and Dusty are bro-in-laws, that means that our sisters...
Our sisters are sister-in-laws?
Our sisters... No. It means that our wives are sisters. There, I got the family tree right.
Yeah.
And so I am a native Houstonian. I am a father of 2 adopted kiddos and 2 adopted doggos. And for a job, I am a research scientist. I work for a large chemical company doing research and development in our labs. Professionally, my background is chemistry, organic chemistry specifically. So some of my hobbies are related to science. I like to make soap in my garage. That's the only thing I make in my garage.
Oh, really?
Yes. That's not made out of wood or something like that.
Yeah.
I used to play a lot of disc golf, but I don't do that much anymore. Sports have always been a big hobby of mine. Trying to stay fit, and I'd say related to what we're going to talk about today, one of my hobbies is being a amateur theologian and Christian apologist, I guess you would say, and researching or reading about the interface between theology and science.
Hashtag nerd.
Nerd alert. Nerd alert. Nerd alert. Pretty much.
So when we come and visit you in Houston, you have tons of like sciencey experiments for us to do, which is always fun. And also proves that if you don't play video games all the time, maybe you'll do something with your life.
It's quite possible. It's quite possible.
So, anyways, but we have a lot of fun here every time we come. We came for vacation, and with the COVID stuff, not much to do outside of our house, but it's been like a staycation for you, a vacation for me, and I think every time we come, your wife is the planner, so is my wife. So they have tons of things for us to do. We have a schedule to follow for the most part, and video games is a part of that schedule. So
it's penciled in all the blank spaces.
The very few blank spaces that there are. So
that's right.
So we've done a lot of fun ones this week, dissecting owl droppings, pellets, and weird stuff like that.
Making slime,
making the what are we getting ready to do? The
elephant toothpaste.
Yeah, so that'll be fun.
We would be doing all these without kids here too, right?
Right. Yeah. Oh, we're kids? Where are kids at? Yeah, exactly. But today we were talking, and I was like, shut up. Let's hold this. Let's record a podcast before we get too far into it. But I want to talk a little bit about creation and the idea. There's multiple ideas of, was it 7 literal days? Did Jesus really take a full calendar week, and create everything, or did it span from millions of years, thousands of years,
billions of years?
Who knows? But so just a background for me, I've grown up church boy like yourself, I believe, right?
Yeah.
And so, but my indoctrined theory of creation was 7 literal days, was that the calendar existed before creation. So God made sure to create it within the calendar week. No, I'm just, I've been taught that the earth is maybe like 10,000 years old, that carbon dating is a flawed system, that dinosaurs existed before the flood.
So at the same time as people. for a little bit.
Correct. Like one little interpretation of a verse that maybe says that. That the flood of Noah is what put maybe the whole hole in the ozone layer. Like around that, everybody lived for like 1,000 years or whatever.
Oh, snap. I'd never heard that before.
And so like volcanic eruptions like were everywhere, and that's where all the water came from basically. To flood the whole earth was the water that was surrounding the earth. Something like that. But so I've been taught that, which is fine, and I would be in science class, and when we talk about Darwinism and evolution, my school was weird. They didn't really grade your papers. She just made sure you did your homework. And so I would just write Bible verses as my answers. So I had like 100% homework grades and like 30% test scores.
Whoa.
So like it was terrible. And they're like, Dusty, you're really doing a good job with your homework, but I'm just not a good test taker. I'm sorry.
That's it. Just not good at tests.
It's not that I don't study. And so you had talked about, from a Christian standpoint, the possibility of believing that the earth is millions of years old. And so I wanted to kind of dig into that a little deeper and tell us everything you know about everything.
Everything I know about everything. Ready, go.
Ready now.
I think we were probably brought up fairly similarly in that I don't ever remember being told specifically by my parents one way or another, like Genesis is literal, Genesis isn't literal. I just remember growing up learning the Bible. I suspect my dad is a geologist, and so, of course, his whole job is based upon the idea that the earth is billions of years old.
Wait. Your dad's Ross from Friends? Is that what Ross was a geologist?
Was he an anthropologist?
Oh, anthropologist. Okay.
So
I cut you off. My bad.
Similar in that they both deal with digging up old stuff.
It's got an ist in it. Come on.
Except the geologists usually dig up oil.
Oh.
So,
gotcha.
Ross dug up the bones of fossilized creatures, and the geologists look for oil inside of rock formations that came from decomposed creatures.
Gotcha.
Looking back on it now, I know that my dad would not have been a, quote, young earth creationist thinking that the earth was only 10,000 years old, because everything he was taught in school would have told him otherwise, and yet he was also a Christian. And so I know that he had somehow rationalized these things in his mind. And I think my parents really wanted me to kind of figure out whatever my view was on my own. Mm-hmm. I don't remember having a lot of conflicts in school about it. Yeah, so I guess growing up with a Christian worldview, being a Bible-believing Christian, being that the Bible is the inspired word of God, as I started to, I guess, expand out in my scientific endeavors and be a little bit more in tune with what the kind of leading theologians and scientists say on this topic that we're talking about, creation. How did it happen? How long ago did it happen? I kind of started to investigate for myself, at least from a layman's standpoint, I would say, or maybe slightly more knowledgeable than a layman. How can these views be brought together? And one key distinction that I really like was that in general, science and religion actually seek to answer two different questions. Religion in general answers, why are we here? We need a purpose for life. So religion helps us answer that question. Science many times answers, how are things working while we are here? So I think when you combine those two things together, you can get a lot of cooperation. I think there's a lot of really smart theologians and scientists who believe that science and religion can work together. But one place you get heads butting together, of course, is this creation situation, right?
Right, yeah.
So first,
because that kind of sets the standard for everything, really.
Yeah, some people would say, if you don't believe Genesis is literal, then how can you believe anything in the rest of the Bible? You're setting it up for not believing the rest of Scripture if you don't believe the beginning.
Well, and with the millions of years, billions of years old versus 10,000 years, things have to happen differently.
Oh, yeah.
Time periods of things have to be different.
Yeah, so you've ended up with a lot of Christians who feel like that the first 11 chapters of Genesis must be interpreted word for word as a literal truth, trying to fit scientific theories into that truth in their mind. And it really butts up against a lot of what science has told us. And, I think God created people with a mind for learning. I think that's one of the cool things about humans as created beings. There's a lot of special things that separate us apart from the rest of the animals. One of those is a mind for learning and for science. I think God created that desire to learn inside of human nature. And I don't think he would have done that just to trick us. To be like, well, I'm going to create this universe and you can learn all this stuff from it. But really, it happened a different way. And so I think that the desire to learn is inside of each one of us to a certain degree. And people take that to different parts of what they're interested in. So there's a lot of science and religion areas, subtopics, I guess, subfields that come into contact with each other, and a lot of people butt heads over it. Of course, now on social media, you see people butting heads over things all the time.
Like anything.
Yeah.
There's somebody there. That's usually Andrew and my relationship is he likes to argue and I don't. So then he wins every argument just by default.
Right. So this field that I've been following fairly recently, there's a really prominent theologian named William Lane Craig, and he's a philosopher, he's a theologian, he's a Christian apologist, and I just listened to a long series that he did on the first 11 chapters of Genesis, only looking at it from a literary standpoint, just looking at the body of work as a piece of literature. What does it plausibly say? And I know that it's possible. It's possible for God to do anything, right? So I think God could have created the whole universe yesterday and implanted us with all of our memories, and literally everything's only existed for a day. That's possible.
Yeah.
Is it plausible? I don't think so. And I think when you look at Genesis, the first 11 chapters of Genesis are usually kind of considered separate from the rest of it as the creation story. I like to look at it from a what is plausible, what is most plausible question, not a what is possible point of view. And I think when you get into the body of Genesis 1 through 11, there are multiple things that point to it being a much more figurative work of literature than a, quote, literal work of literature. And that probably rankles some people's feathers because they hear, well, you're just saying that it's not true. And I think there's the true meaning of interpreting something literally is not literally taking it word for word. It's looking at the whole scope of a piece of literature. It's looking at when was it written, who wrote it, who was it written to, what did the world look like at the time that it was written, and what was the purpose of the writing. And since this is a relatively short podcast, one possible view you can get out of answering those questions is that Genesis actually reads like the first 11 chapters of Genesis actually read more like an ancient what's classified as mytho-historical work. Now, people hear the word myth and they absolutely freak out because you're saying Genesis is a myth and you're saying it's not true.
We take it literal.
Look up what a myth actually is, and in ancient literature, a myth was actually typically a story told about something that happened in the very distant past that was grounded in realities of the present for the author. So saying that the first 11 chapters of Genesis are in a genre called mytho-history is just saying that the author, which many people suspect to be Moses, I believe, wrote this part of Genesis as a way to educate his people, God's people, on the nature of God and, in a general sense, how creation happened. There are a bunch of general, I think one way you can look at this is there's a bunch of general truths in this creation story. God created the world out of nothing. That's a general truth you can get out of it. God created humans separate and special from all the other beings on the planet. That's a general truth you can get out of it. God has a covenant with his people. You can get that. So there's all these great truths that they don't go away when you consider Genesis 1 through 11 from a non-literal standpoint. From a science standpoint, I think there's a lot of issues with trying to force science to prove a young Earth creationist view. There's just a lot of things that don't make sense. And so as a scientist, I had to come to some kind of rational view for myself, honestly, on how do I rationalize my religion and what I know to be true from various scientific experiments and data that I can look at and read about. And in coming to this, I have found absolutely nothing that says you have to believe in science or you have to believe in religion.
Right.
And a lot of people get stuck on that. Like, well, you got to believe this or you got to believe that. And I think they work beautifully together.
So one of the arguments when it came to literal translation translation was and I was trying to look it up while you're talking, so I was paying attention to you. But there's some volcano on the other side of the world that had erupted and like a huge chunk of rock landed into a lake, and it's made big enough waves that it kind of moved the lake, and then slowly kind of the water kept going back and forth, carving a groove that I think was like a fourth the size of the volcano, or as a fourth the size of the Grand Canyon in a matter of
A short amount of time.
days instead of millions of years.
So,
So that was like proof that possibly the flood created the Grand Canyon, not millions of years of water running
right.
this one thing. Just, I think for them, and maybe me too, but for the literal translation people, the flood did a lot of things
Yes.
to shape the world. And so a lot of things come from the flood itself. And so that's where they say like the earth was more not flat, but not as
Right.
curved and stuff. And so all of that happened through the events that had to create the flood to gather enough water to flood the earth.
And I think another belief that is kind of common for people looking at it from this young Earth creation standpoint is that before, so you can tell me if I'm right or not. Before the flood, it never rained,
Correct.
and then at the flood and afterwards, it rained from there on out.
Correct.
And that's one thing that, from what I would say from a plausibility standpoint, doesn't actually make a lot of sense, because there's different places in the Old Testament where the Israelites actually had a fairly, you can read in Scripture, and I don't have these off the top of my head, but places that actually show that the Israelites had a decent understanding of what we would call the water cycle. So, it rains, water flows through rivers and stuff, it goes into the ocean, then evaporates, forms clouds, and rains again, right? The water cycle our kids learn about in like second grade. The Israelites actually understood this. So for an Israelite author to literally think that it didn't rain before the flood and it rained after the flood, from a plausibility standpoint, that's just not plausible. And so that's one of those situations where, well, if he was telling the story figuratively, it all kind of works itself out. You don't have to take these as micro facts and be like, well, I gotta fit this into the scientific theory somehow, that it didn't rain before the flood and it rained after the flood, and here's 3 reasons why. Another area that people really have trouble with, I think, like atheists and non-believers or agnostics have trouble with, is just looking at the first 2 chapters of Genesis. It kind of tells the creation story twice. Okay. Right, it kind of goes through the days in Genesis 1, and then in Genesis 2, it tells the story again. It basically walks through creation again, but almost from a different viewpoint, and things actually happen in a different order.
Oh.
So if you look at them literally word for word, you would actually have to think that the author was purposely writing the story 2 different ways, and no one would do that on purpose if they were trying to tell a historical story. But if they were just trying to illustrate God's providence and some of the basic, mechanisms that God used to create the universe, then sure, he illustrates how important creation is by telling it twice in 2 different ways. And so I think you really get stuck trying to fit square pegs into round holes when you say, well, it has to be 100% literal, and there's no figurative language in these scriptures.
So what you're saying, that it is possible to believe in science
It is.
and believe in Jesus. It actually works.
And I think, it's looking at the different parts of the Bible as pieces of literature and kind of what type of literature are they. Like everybody kind of accepts that Psalms is poetry, right?
Right.
Psalms, nobody has problems saying that Psalms has a bunch of figurative language in it.
Right.
I mean, it's very illustrative. David's, his laments and his praises. There's all sorts of similes, metaphors, and figurative language in the Psalms. Nobody has a problem with that. But I think when people hear that the creation story in Genesis may be told a little bit more figurative than they think, then it just sends people off of a cliff, and they think, well, you're not even believing in the Bible anymore. For me personally, Genesis is a completely separate book from the New Testament. It's written by different people at a different time. I mean, I have no problem believing in the historical Jesus, and I think there's a lot of evidence for Jesus being exactly the person and personification of God that the New Testament authors say that he is.
Right.
And this kind of brings up another little subtopic, which is that Genesis is referenced a lot in the New Testament. Jesus talks about Adam. And some people will say, well, if Jesus talks about Adam and now you're saying that Genesis is figurative, then are you saying that Jesus was wrong when he referenced the New Testament? And people that's an important point. I would agree with that. You got to kind of figure out, well, was Jesus kind of going with the knowledge of the time, and people at that time believed that Genesis was 100% literally true, and so he was just speaking in a language they would understand, but he really knew that it wasn't true.
Right.
Or what? And one way that this could be explained that I've heard is that, let's say we're talking and we're talking about some sensitive topic, and one of us says something and the other one says, well, you just opened Pandora's box on that one, buddy. Mm-hmm. Does that mean that you actually believe there was a person named Pandora and that she had a box and that the box was opened and all sorts of things came out of it? No, it does not. It does not mean that. What it does mean is that you're taking a reference from literature and using it to illustrate a current truth. And so that's one possible way to look at why Jesus or any of these other New Testament authors would have mentioned Genesis or characters from Genesis.
So you're saying it's possible that Adam and Eve aren't really Adam and Eve?
It is. I think there are of course genealogies in Genesis, mm-hmm. and that's where a lot of people get the age of the earth, right? They add up all the years of all the people.
Right.
And so there's kind of two ways to look at Adam and Eve. You can have a literal Adam and Eve, or you can have a historical Adam and Eve. Were Adam and Eve truly the first people, and they were the only two people? Here's where you get to the incongruencies with Genesis 1 and 2. Genesis 1 talks about Adam and Eve like they're the only two people, but then in Genesis 2 or 3, right, when Cain kills Abel, Cain gets sent off, right. And it says he goes off and basically starts his own family.
But with who?
With who? With the monkeys?
Oh man!
And so you kind of get stuck in these situations did Adam and Eve have a belly button? That
right.
That kind of stuff. And you go down these rabbit holes. And I think if you just take a step back and just at least open part of the mind to the idea that this book may have been written for people to understand at any time. It's written for kids to understand God's providence in creation. It's written for adults to understand it. It's written for people to understand it 3,000 years ago when they had no knowledge of science and it made total sense. And it's written for us to be able to understand it now, given everything that we know about it. I think it's really a beautiful book, and it does stand the test of time, and it stands the test of different viewpoints, looking at its truthfulness.
Yeah, I agree. And so we're going to end the podcast here because we could just keep going.
We could go for a while.
Every time you talk and you say something, it
brings up something else.
Something else, yeah. So we should have podcasted on the first day, not the last day.
We could have had a series.
We could have had a series going, but
our wives didn't plan the podcast schedule.
They did not. I mean, Shay had told me a couple times, "Don't forget," and I kept forgetting. So it was Rocket League or podcast. What are we gonna do? So, but thanks for being on. To me, it was just more when we're having a conversation. I had a very immature reaction to people who believed in science when I was younger.
Right.
And so just being able to be a little bit older in everything in my life, I've been able to see things differently or see things outside the box of what everybody's been saying, and the whole podcast kind of theme is around the fact that the church back in the day hated rock and roll music. It was of the devil. All of a sudden, we're playing rock and roll music in churches for God, and so it's like the church, in my experience, my dad marrying a divorced person, my mom who was divorced, my dad married her and was very looked down upon of, oh my gosh, that's terrible sin. And all of a sudden, like there's pastors who are now divorced and it's fine, so it's just a different like viewpoint of it. And so to me, like taking everything with what one person's belief is and not working it out yourself and saying like, is it actually right?
Right.
Like,
and how does it interact with your view of the gospel, right? I mean, I personally don't think this issue is a salvation issue.
Exactly.
It's a great thing to be interested in. It's a great way to bring atheists or other agnostics into Christian lines of thought to get them thinking.
Yeah.
Conversation. Most atheists basically decide to be atheists when they're teenagers. Right. Most.
Yeah.
And so what you have is a lot of adult atheists who have very immature views of Scripture because they decided when they were a teenager. How many things do you decide when you're a teenager that you like regret, right?
Exactly.
So yeah, but you're exactly right. Things change, viewpoints change. I mean, what Copernicus, right, said that the earth moves around the sun, not the sun moves around the earth. And he was like almost killed for it or something, or he was excommunicated from the church.
Right.
Because people latched onto some scripture that said the earth is the center of the universe. And this guy was like, well, I got these cool scientific instruments that nobody else knows how to use.
Yeah.
But they're telling me this earth actually moves around the sun. And when you get stuck just forcing yourself to only have one view on one topic and not even be open to evidence,
right?
Evidence that might point a different direction, then that's to me that's a closed-minded place to be.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of really smart theologians and Christian scholars out there who do believe that science and theology and Christianity can actually work really well together.
Side note: the shepherds and the wise men they were following the stars, so they have been dedicating their life following the stars to see.
Yeah.
What was happening. So astrology, all that stuff is not necessarily technically evil if God is showing himself through the stars.
They use the
if
stars.
you pay attention. So it's things
now,
like that.
Yeah, that's right.
So
keep going. But
yeah, we'll stop here. So all right, thanks for being on. Thanks for tuning in, guys. We will be back with Boring Andrew next week. See ya.